Welcome back to part 2 of the master-slave dialectic. Last time, we explored how Hegel reached his rather counterintuitive conclusion that the enslaved might have more actual agency than the master. If you're not too familiar with Hegel or feeling a bit rusty, please go and watch part 1 of the video first. You can find the link in the description or click on the top right corner here. Hegel is notoriously difficult, but contextualizing him always helps. We started with the most abstract theories about the spirit, then saw how its inner workings unfolded in a specific stage, and now we are going to yet another level of concreteness. In today's video, we turn to perhaps the most famous autobiographical account of enslavement, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, as a provocative example of how Hegel plays out in real life. As you might remember from high school or college English, Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, fortunate enough to get an education because the person who owned him was kind of a noob, and made his way out of there. Then he wrote perhaps the most important piece of document for the abolitionist movement, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was the first of his many autobiographies, but often seen as his best and the most rhetorically robust. A pivotal moment in his narrative is a fight, like a literal physical fight, with a notorious quote-unquote slave breaker named Edward Covey, which Douglass later identified as the start of his emancipatory progress. We will zoom into this scene and examine it through the lens of Hegel's master-slave dialectic covered in part 1. The event leading up to this is that Douglass was transferred over to an especially cruel master, Thomas Auld, who found him to be unmanageable and rented him out to work for a year under Edward Covey, someone famous for taming the enslaved. Under Covey, Douglass was forced to work as a field hand for the first time, which was quite a learning curve since he has only worked in houses before. The first task he was assigned was to get a group of unbroken arsons to transport firewood, or in Hegel's language, negate the object on the master's behalf so it is ready for the latter's consumption. Douglass, being new to all this, was nearly killed in the process. When the arsons got frightened and started randomly charging about, he, quote, expected every moment that his brains would be dashed out against the trees, end quote. In Hegel, this would be the constant kind of confrontation of death that the enslaved experiences through labor. Unlike the romantic with the big R ideals of his time, the natural world for Hegel is a raw and elemental place, full of terrors like the dashing arsons. Meanwhile, it is this very aspect of labor that allows the enslaved to overcome their fear of death and gain a sort of immediacy against the world, which here means quite literally the ability to not be mediated by other objects. It is important to note that in real-world situations like this one, the object is often not singular. Rather, there are quite a few layers to this. Covey needs to negate the subjecthood of Douglass, so Douglass can follow his orders to negate the agency and free will of the arsons, who Douglass in turn needs to transport the firewood so he wouldn't have to do it himself. And it doesn't just end there. On top of Covey, there are two other masters, Douglass's owner Thomas Auld, and more specifically in this case, the person who paid Covey for the firewood. This person is literally 3 degrees removed from labor, since they require the mediation of 3 others, Covey, Douglass, and the arsons, in a descending order of subjecthood, to get them their firewood. Out of these 3 master-slave relations, Hegel's dialectic can only resolve the one between Covey and Douglass. The old Covey one is a rather distorted example of labor-capital relations under capitalism that we'll soon cover in Alienation, while the Douglass arson one has more to do with animal rights. Okay, moving on with the narrative. Douglass went back more or less empty-handed, which got him a severe whipping from Covey. After this, he was handed extremely heavy work, barely given any time to eat or rest, and brutally beaten almost on a weekly basis. There was this one time when he fainted in the fields due to exhaustion, and in response, Covey repeatedly kicked him in the side and struck his head heavily with a chair until blood came gushing out. This scare tactic almost worked, as Douglass later admitted that he was on the brink of giving up his hopes for freedom, until that one morning when everything changed. I'll let Douglass tell the rest of the story, since he did it so much better.
All went well till Monday morning. On this morning, the virtue of the root was fully tested. Long before daylight, I was called to go and rub, curry, and feed the horses. I obeyed, and was glad to obey. But whilst thus engaged, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades from the loft, Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope, and just as I was half out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs, and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my legs, I was brought sprawling on the stable floor. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know, I resolved to fight, and, suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me, and I to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and, while Covey held me, attempted to tie my right hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I watched my chance, and gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes, so that he left me in the hands of Mr. Covey. This kick had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but Covey also. When he saw Hughes bending over with pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I was determined to be used so no longer. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying just out of the stable door. He meant to knock me down. But just as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar, and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. By this time, Bill came. Covey called upon him for assistance. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Covey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Bill said his master hired him out to work, and not to help to whip me. So he left Covey and myself to fight our own battle out. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get hold of me again. No, thought I, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom, and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence, and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. From this time I was never again what might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterwards. I had several fights, but was never whipped.
Well, the passage is so eloquent that it kind of speaks for itself. Through constantly confronting death in his daily routine, Douglas has gradually overcome his fear of it and thus gained the resolve to fight to the death against Covey. A man with a whip can't be more scary than a group of wild arsons, right? At this moment, Douglas possessed everything it takes for a self-consciousness to win the struggle unto death, as he would rather die than submit again to the domination of the other. The one excruciatingly long paragraph in which the entire fight takes place is a stylized form of exhibiting an intensity that signifies how he is in it for the long haul. Either he breaks Covey or Covey breaks him. Though it won't be another few years until he gains his actual freedom, this moment made it just a matter of time because it allowed him to reconstitute his personhood and reverse the effects of slavery. As Douglas remarked in a later text, My Bondage and My Freedom, quote, when a slave cannot be flogged, he is more than half free, end quote. Covey, on the other hand, chickened out. He, quote, trembled like a leaf, end quote, which sounds suspiciously like how the self-consciousness losing the struggle unto death, quote, has been quite unmanned and has trembled in every fiber of his being, end quote, before finally submitting and becoming enslaved. Well, Covey couldn't be enslaved or unmanned, but from this moment on, he is no longer a master in any real or concrete sense. A fight is probably the most direct way to negate some relation. Douglas won it because he had nothing to lose, and was thus truly self-standing. In contrast, you can see that the masters here have multiple layers of dependencies, as it is exactly all these dependencies that allow Douglas to force Auld and Covey to back down. Auld depends on Covey to negate the personhood of the enslaved. Remember how Hegel's self-consciousness cares a lot about becoming self-standing, self-sufficient, and independent? Those are important things because they constitute its sense of personhood, which was given up when the enslaved lost the struggle unto death. But that was not the end of the story, as the enslaved can slowly regain their personhood through experiencing labor as something formative, since labor allows them to gain a more direct and more immediate relation to objects than the master. Before Douglas was rendered to Covey, he used to intentionally let Thomas Auld's horses run wild to another farm so he could eat a full meal there. Douglas's consciousness to resist and look out for himself was only possible because he is aware that he has a more immediate control over the horses than Auld does. In any case, despite winning the fight, Douglas was still in grave danger. Given that this was the antebellum South, Covey had the right to have Douglas whipped publicly or even executed by the authorities. In fact, Douglas later admitted that even he was not sure why Covey didn't do it. So why didn't he? The answer reveals yet another layer of Covey's dependencies. Douglas might be ready to die to not be whipped again. Covey, on the other hand, cannot afford to let that happen. He does not have the money to compensate Douglas's owner, and also needs to protect his reputation as a quote-unquote slave breaker. In other words, in that moment, Douglas's life was paradoxically more important to Covey than Douglas himself, albeit for a very self-serving reason. It's kind of like how Hegel's notion of desire works. If Douglas dies, then Covey's reputation falls apart with it. The gist is that if you fully objectify someone like that, you in turn will also move backwards and become less of a subject yourself. One key caveat though, in Hegel, the master and the enslaved never actually fight. Instead, the struggle unto death happens before the master-slave relation is established, when the two self-consciousnesses were still equals in a primitive sense. The fight was also not directly about enslavement or emancipation, but to have one's subjectivity or point of view recognized as the more authoritative one. In other words, for Hegel, the master-slave relation is the outcome instead of the premise of the struggle unto death, and it also doesn't conclude in an episodic way like a fight. It ends not with a bang, but a whimper, as T.S. Eliot would put it. Hegel didn't specify how the enslaved moves into the next stage, the unhappy consciousness, but presumably it is a rather gradual and mundane process instead of a revolutionary act. On a more contextual level, Douglas's experience resonates more with 20th century post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon, who used Hegel's concept of recognition to demonstrate the necessity of violence in the anti-colonial struggle. Since the emancipation of Douglas is a provocative but not exact embodiment of Hegel's allegory, I will also have to troubleshoot some other premises. In the last video, I mentioned how Hegel's notions of the master and the slave are more based on European feudalism than chattel slavery in America. So one might naturally question whether these categories are applicable to one another, or whether Hegel's theory is at all commensurable with Douglas's real-life experience. Nonetheless, all of these parallels that we just covered seemed to naturally fall in place. Maybe the master-slave dialectic really gets to something more universal in all forms of bondage and oppression. In a pivotal capacity, it inspired Marx's theory of alienation, the third-wave feminism of Judith Butler, and, as I mentioned earlier, the post-colonial existentialism of Frantz Fanon. Its intellectual descendants span across race, gender, and class. You can't get more leftist range than that. Not just the left, Hegel is intensely relevant for the right as well, but that's the topic for another video. I should probably stop right there before I go off on a whole different tangent. Anyways, another potential concern here is that since the autobiographical genre is a detached look back on one's own life, it is in a way also an abstraction, which defeats the purpose of bringing Hegel down to concrete reality. Admittedly, there might have been some kind of over-smoothing on Douglas's part. He is crafting a linear narrative after all. But it still gives us a concrete sense of what events mattered the most to him and how he understood their significance. If anything, the subjective element in Douglas would be helpful here, since for Hegel, the master-slave dialectic is still a rather subjective phase of the self-consciousness, especially considering what is to come later. Okay, that's about it for today, and in the next video, we will finally get started on the concept of alienation itself. This is a brand new channel, so please bring my video to a larger audience with a simple like and subscribe. Thank you, and see you next time.